Okay, if you've ever wanted to use the repeater in After Effects to create explosions like this, stick around and I'll show you how it's done. Okay, so if you've ever wanted to learn how to use the repeater in After Effects, we're just going to go through a simple process here of how to make round exploding shape movements here using the repeater. So let's go ahead and show you how this is done, and we'll go ahead and start a new comp. We'll set it to 1920 by 1080, about 5 seconds should be fine. And the first thing we're going to do is come down to our layer stack and right click and choose New Shape Layer. Now that's going to give us a shape layer, but it's not actually going to give us any shapes. So we need to then open it up and go down to the Add window. And let's start by adding a rectangle. Now notice we get the path of a rectangle, but as it stands right now, it doesn't have a stroke or a fill. So we need to add that to it. So we'll go back to that Add button and we'll click Stroke. Nice thing about Stroke is that you can use trim paths with it. Gives you a lot of flexibility, and you can always add a fill later if you want one. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll just animate this to move. We can go ahead and adjust the stroke a little bit. Notice if we open up rectangle, we can adjust the size of this rectangle, we can move its position, and we can actually adjust its roundness, which is kind of cool. If we decide we want a circle or we want it to morph into a circle, we've got those controls available. Let's go down to our stroke and let's add a stroke of about 20. And if we put that in the middle, the next thing we want to do is we want to animate this to do something. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. It could just be literally moving up in the screen, or rotating, or changing its size. But let's go ahead and do something simple. We'll go ahead and click Position, and we'll move the playhead forward 1 second, and we'll move it up in the screen. So anywhere near the top. In mine, I've got it at about -400. So we've got this. It's moving up. Okay, cool. And we can do more later. So now let's go ahead and turn this into a circle of rectangles by adding a repeater. So we've got our contents here, which right now consist of rectangle path 1, stroke 1, and nothing else. If we open up the Add button again, we can go down to Repeater. And that's going to add a repeater. Now, the repeater can be a little tricky to wrap your head around. So I want to give you one specific thing that you can do with the repeater that will always give you good results. And that is creating a circle of whatever shapes you're working with, whether it's a star, a stroke, a rectangle, it doesn't matter. Here is the recipe for creating a circle using the repeater. You're going to open it up, and however many copies you decide you want to use, we could bump this up to, let's say, 12. Then we want to go down to Transform Repeater 1. And all we need to do to turn this line of shapes into a circle is set its position to 0. Now what that's going to do is it's going to stack all those rectangles on top of each other. The next thing we want to do is go down to Rotation and set the rotation to basically divide 360 degrees by however many copies we have. So for this example, I'm going to go 360, and I'm going to use a slash in between the 360, and then I'm going to type in 12. And the nice thing is After Effects is going to do the math for us. It's going to divide 360 by 12. And if I hit return, you'll see that we now have a circle of shapes. And since we are at the end of our 1 second and we animated this earlier, if I move it in, you can see that they all overlap each other and they all start from the same spot right here. Okay, now if that's not something you want, that's an easy thing to fix. But the point is, if you take nothing else away from this example, take away the fact that in order to create a circle, you just need to take however many copies you have and divide the rotation, divide 360 by your 12 copies. You're also going to want to set the position value under Transform Repeater 1 to 0. Okay, and that's basically going to do this. It's going to start you with everything right on top of itself. Now, since we animated this to move out earlier, now they're moving out. But we do have this sort of time where they're overlapping and creating this wheel. and you may or may not want that in your animation. An easy way to fix that is to then go back to your rectangle path number 1, and we can just adjust the size. So if we go down to the beginning here and we set our size value down to something like 0, and then we jump to the 1 second mark and we crank it up to 100 or larger, should we want to go larger, you'll see that now we don't get that wheel effect to the same degree. If we had less copies, we could probably avoid that, or we could even move this keyframe forward a little bit, and that could help avoid the overlapping. So that in its most basic form is how you can make something pop out like that. Now if we want to add some style to it, one thing that I would recommend is having these fade off as they grow. And one way we could do that would be by animating the stroke width. Right now our stroke width, if we come down to stroke, is set to 21. So if we start it at 21 and then jump forward to 1 second and then drop it down to 0, now it's going to be growing as the stroke gets thinner. And that'll look like this. Gives it a nice sort of drifting effect, and it sort of just subtly disappears. A couple other things we could do to make that more interesting would be to add motion blur. But not only add motion blur, but actually go up and adjust our motion blur. If you watch what happens here, you see that my motion blur probably looks a little different than yours. And the reason is because if you go up to composition, comp settings, you can actually come down to your advanced section right here. And if you play with your shutter angle, you'll find that you get some pretty interesting effects with motion blur. Right now, I've cranked my shutter angle up to 720. Yours is probably defaulting to 180. And I've played with the number of frames. Now, you can see I'm getting 3 trails or 3 additions. If I crank that number up, we'll see more of those. And that can look kind of cool too. So if you play with your number of your samples and you crank up the shutter angle, you'll see your motion blur becomes a lot more sort of mechanical looking and a little less blurry. On top of that, if we select this layer and we open everything up and we hit the U key, there's all of our keyframes. We can go ahead and select our keyframes and hit Function F9 to turn them into Easy Ease keyframes. And once we do that, we can then go to our graph editor and select the right point over here, and we'll just grab this Bezier handle and slide it over to the left, and that'll give it a little bit more of an exploding feel. It'll pop out faster and then sort of slow down as it disappears. And if we back it up and take a look, we get something that looks like that. So we can see that we've got this really interesting exploding circle that now, because of the motion blur, starts out, we get these really interesting shapes, and we get something like that. And of course, you could sit and pile things onto this all day long. You could go into layer styles and put a bevel and emboss on here and get a little faux 3D look. You could add an echo effect. There's just a million things you could do. But one of the coolest ways to tweak your repeaters is to simply duplicate the entire group. So we take shape layer 1 and we duplicate it and we maybe throw it out of sync a little bit. Now we've got something that looks like this, and it's still pretty cool and interesting. But if we go into shape layer 2 and we go into contents and we then go into rectangle, we can start to play with the size of this rectangle. It doesn't have to look exactly like the other one. We could unlock the constrained proportions lock, and we could go over and play with the look of our shape. If we go out to about here and we decide to maybe make it look a little longer and a little narrower, get something like that. And again, if we're using the same amount of pieces, it looks interesting. And then we could just simply pull that out towards the end and see what we get. Okay, so as you can see, we get this interesting stretching of lines there. We could even pull that keyframe out a little bit as well. And notice that with very little effort, now we have two layers that look pretty cool and pretty different. And of course, if we wanted to with this one, we could add a fill by just going to Add and choosing Fill. And if we have a fill color selected, it'll automatically add that in. So as we can see here, there we go. Now we're getting that fill that we weren't seeing before. And again, since we only had the animation on the stroke value, notice that the fill is staying on even when the image is done. We could easily go in and just select the fill and then go back maybe to 1 second, add a keyframe for opacity, and go forward and set it down to 0 so that it animates to fade off the same way the stroke lines did. Again, play with this. You'll get different results every time you do it. If you want to add more of those lines, we can always go down to the repeater and we could double the number of copies. Let's bump it up to 24. Hit return, and then we'll go down to transform repeater and we'll just make sure to set our rotation to 360 divided by 24. And when we look at that, now we have doubled the numbers of those pieces. And so, you might want to play with this without having those opacity animations or the stroke width, just so you can see what you're doing. And then you can add those effects to make it fade off in an interesting way. But the idea simply that I want you to take away from this is how easy it is to create an exploding circle of shapes and how easy it is to duplicate that layer and play with it and get different results. Something fun. All right, hope you enjoyed that. And if you want to learn more about After Effects, go ahead and like and subscribe, and there'll be more lessons to come.